Okay, this is the reverse flyback motor design. It's not a generator design. I took out uh, I removed, how do I say this? I removed the flyback from hitting the battery. So basically, before the flyback would come out here, this diode here, the high voltage diode, and it would go down here and hit the battery. Now it's hitting the coil. Give me 1 second. So before it was hitting, the flyback was hitting the battery down here before. There was 2 batteries and some capacitors and some Zener diodes, and you can see that in the other videos. But now this is a motor design, not generator. Based off the Bedini SG circuit. This is the Bedini SG times 2, open source, open to be modified as well. Um, so basically, the flyback comes out here. So this top coil gets charged by this battery, and then it will fly out here. The flyback will fly, the positive of the flyback will come out here. It'll hit this side of the coil, and the negative of the flyback will go this way and hit the other side of the coil. So in this way, you'll have essentially for one pulse on one coil, you'll have another pulse on the other coil right after that. It's kind of like lightning fast. So you could put 2 magnets 180 degrees apart around a rotor with these 2 coils, and it'll get spin. And when those 2 magnets 180 degrees apart rotate 90 degrees, you'll have another 2 magnets on the other 180-degree angle for the bottom coil, for this bottom coil, and this coil will be lined up for those other 2 magnets on the same rotor. So 4 magnets on one rotor. And when this bottom coil receives positive forward plus here, this side, forward voltage minus here, switches will then open, fly out, flyback will come out here, hit this side of the inductor, and the negative flyback will go up here, up this way, or this way, and hit the other side of the same inductor. So then you'll have another 2 coils getting a field charge on the 90 degree for every 90 degrees. So if your rotor spins 90 degrees, it switches to the other 2 coils that are 180 degrees apart. So I will draw that really quickly. Let me show you here. So you have a rotor. Excuse me. Where is that? You have a rotor, right? Let me get this there here. Draw a circle. You have 4 magnets on the circle, all facing north outwards. You'll have 2 drive coils. Right there. Oops, my bad. You're not going to do this wiring, by the way. You're just going to use the circuit as shown and place the two of the four coils. You take one pair and you put them 180 degrees around the rotor. One switching pair. Again, one coil is receiving forward DC power, and the other coil receives flyback. But it happens so quick that it's like the same instantaneous. So you put it here. Those two, that one pair of coils. The other pair go up here. Okay. And going back to this circuit, one of those pairs of coils 180 degrees apart would be this bottom one, which then these two switches close, charge up this coil, then these two switches open, it flies out this way, flies back into this coil. So these two coils would be, let's say, the top two here, all right, these two. And then these two coils you'll put over here on the horizontal axis. And now you can add a trigger winding. Since you're going to have magnets passing one of these coils, you can add a trigger winding here. Or you can, let me just say this another way, you can trigger these two transistors at the base, hit the base of both of these transistors at the same time with the same wire, trigger winding. And how you would wire that up here would be, I believe it's the, I don't know, I think it's I think it's here, you know. Well, and I guess wherever your magnet passes, you know, if you have a core on this electromagnet, imagine there's a core here, and your magnet passes over it. I believe here, so it might have been like this. There, when the magnet would drive the horizontal magnets here. Okay, these two. And these two would drive these coils. And there you have it. So in this system, the batteries are not receiving charge at all. What's going on is the right battery will charge up. Green is your forward charge. And let me just do this over because I should have made it the other way. Right. So the red coils are receiving 12 volts forward charge from your battery. The green coils are receiving flyback charge. There you have it. That's another way to utilize the flyback with this circuit. There's another way, Um, some people just put two coils in series and then fly back that into another two coils in series. You can do that also. In this case, one coil is being pulsed, not two. And yeah, it's kind of the same difference. um, but when you have two coils in series, you 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 can trigger it with a trigger winding as well. It doesn't matter. There's many ways to utilize the flyback. One way is to have two coils in series flying back into another two series coils. This way is to pulse one coil and oh man, I got this. That one gets pulsed and then it flies back into this one. Dot dot. So yeah, I got this wrong. Let me do this again. So it basically goes like this. This is what's going on here with this circuit. So the bottom coil is pulsed by the left battery, and then it flies back into this coil. So what you'll have here is pulse the bottom coil, and then it flies back into here. So that drives these two magnets. And then the top coil is pulsed by the right side battery, and it will fly back into this coil. And that's your other coil, top coil here, pulsed, and then it flies back into this coil. So that's how that's operating. That's how this motor would be run with this circuit. All right. Happy Sunday. This is open source. Reverse flyback motor. John Bedini SG times 2. Open for mods. Open talk, open mic. Let's talk. See if we can get this thing modified in many different ways. This Bedini SG circuit. Talk to you later. Test.
idea in there. And you could easily add that here without interfering with everything else. Because the flyback is so fast, you don't have to really adjust the position of your second set of drive coils. Well, anyway, that's an idea for the Adams motor here. I thought I'd throw that idea in there. And you could easily add that here without interfering with everything else. Just thought I'd mention that. Okay.
The generator coils in his drawing are very nearly square. Next, you need to notice the proportions of the rotor magnets. They're very much alike. Robert the drive battery. So far, this back cutoff causes a magnetic field in the generator coils which boosts the rotor on its way. Instead, yet it's a very important greater than the width of the core, which act as pickup coils. This is Robert's drawing of his arrangement. You'll notice a number of things here. The four generator coils are mounted physically on a disc or a ring, while the two drive coils are separately mounted on their own mounts. This means that the gap between the generator coils and the drive coils can be adjusted while the motor is running. Also, you'll notice that the width of the core of the collector or generator coils is very much greater than the width of the core of the so-called drive coils. The generator coils in his drawing are very nearly square. Next, you need to notice the proportions of the rotor magnets. They're very much longer than they are wide, separating the outer north poles from the inner south poles. However, a point which seems to escape most people is the fact that a critical part of the design is the technique of cutting off the output power at the appropriate moment. Cutting off the output power sounds all wrong to most people, and yet it's a very important thing to do. The reason is the same as for the drive coils. If you don't cut off the electrical connection, then the attraction between the solid iron cores of the generator coils and the rotor magnets tries to pull the rotor magnets back towards the fixed generator coil cores, an effect which is called drag. But if the output current generated in the coils by the passing magnets is cut off at just the right instant, then the back EMF generated by that cutoff causes a magnetic field in the generator coils which boosts the rotor on its way instead of dragging it backwards. Robert also rectifies that back EMF pulse
Going
and
here
feeds it back to the
is
drive battery.
this is
So far, this is a highly efficient system.
the drive
What
coils,
this diagram
four of
doesn't
them,
show
and they're pulsed DC, positive, negative on the horizontal coils. And then once this negative opens up, becomes a positive. Tap off of it right here with a diode, high voltage. And okay, this becomes a positive right here. Right now it's a negative from your 4 DC pulse. Here's your positive DC, and here's your negative side of this series set of coils here. When you open the switch on this positive will become a negative
Okay. And you're going to connect it here. That positive will become a negative. So I'll put here, hold on a second. Green is your flyback channel. Your reverse polarity flyback from the previous coil that was forward pulsed. So this bottom coil is the one receiving the flyback. Oops, I messed up, sorry. Control Z. I'm sorry, the vertical coil is the one receiving the flyback, okay? And so on. This is my thoughts on the Adams motor upgrade. So in the Adams motor, you just have red is your forward, your battery power is red. Okay, that's your power is coming from the batteries in red. Your power is in red from your battery. As you can see in red, it's plus and plus here, minus on this end. When the switch is opened, the flyback occurs, and it goes into the coil that's in green. That diode is a high voltage diode. And when you open the switch on the red coil, that's receiving forward DC voltage from your battery, which is our traditional energy. The positive of your DC power on that coil will turn into a negative right here. That's why you're going to have it connected here. Okay. Now, what's stopping your positive from connecting here and charging up this coil is in green? The vertical is going to be this diode. Blocks your positive flow. As you can see, your positive will go through this coil, but there is nothing stopping it. If the positive goes through this coil, it gets stopped right at the high voltage diode. You can add a second diode here, a low voltage diode if you want. Makes no difference. I mean, it might make a difference, I don't know, but you can add a low voltage blocking diode here if you want. If you're concerned about your low voltage crossing your high voltage diode the opposite direction, go ahead, add it.
That's what I did in the other circuit. So basically this positive will not be able to flow in this direction because of these diodes. It cannot make it to this negative. But the flyback that occurs here is going to happen right here. This negative that you gave this coil will become a positive on this side of the coil during the flyback, and that positive will flow out these diodes this direction, okay, and through the coil, charging it, and it will reach the negative side of the flyback right here. That's why it works like that. Okay, I just wanted to draw this. This is my idea. It comes from the Adams motor concept. It just it occurred to me this would be a better way to improve upon the design. With the Adams motor, you know, these are 4 drive coils, and he has 4 stator coils also, which you can also add that here on the other angle here. You know, with 4 stator coils in series. Yeah, you get the point.
This is Amanda, who loves a lower price. And this is Fernando, who just had to click twice. CVS helps with your health and your wallet, with 85% of scripts under $10. CVS Pharmacy. Healthier happens together.
Hello, Chris.
Hello, Daniel.
It's a pleasure to have you in here today.
It's a pleasure to be here.
I've been looking forward to doing this podcast for a long time.
I've been dreading it.
We got a lot of stuff to cover today. I've had Ben in here, Ben Kirkwick from Uncharted X a couple times now. And he's talked a lot about some of the stuff that you've been working on for the past few decades. He and I are both huge fans of your work. He obviously, cites all of your work when he does his stuff and when he goes to the pyramids and reports some of the stuff and in his videos on Uncharted X. And that's how I actually first discovered you, was from when Ben came on here about a year ago. After he came in, I read your book, The Giza Power Plant, twice. Just finished reading your new book, The Tesla Connection, which was mind-bending to say the least. Maybe you could give us sort of a brief background on your history and how you got interested in the pyramids of ancient Egypt.
I was raised in a working class family in Manchester, England. And my father was a butcher and my mother was a housewife. And I have 4 siblings, a brother and 3 sisters. So it was a very loving household. And I ultimately decided at the age 15 that I was done with school. And I pled out to take an apprenticeship and was
Quilts.
Echo now inside my head. I reach for you. I reach in vain.
Welcome, everyone. I'm Tomoko Steen at Science, Technology, and Business Division. Today's event is, as you mentioned, sponsored by the Asian Division here, and also Friends Society, and also Science and Technology and Business Division. It's a wonderful cooperation with the Asian Division, and we usually have a much more dry room. This is a very beautiful room we can have the speaker in. So today's speaker, Professor Jonathan Lewis, is the associate professor at Georgetown's Science, Technology Society. Science and Technology and International Affairs at the Georgetown University's Foreign Service Institute. Its official name is Edmund Walsh School of Foreign Service. And her research focus is energy, environment, innovation in China. Some people say that clean energy in China is oxymoron, but it's not actually true. With Dr. Lewis advising, the China is going to be leading the clean energy endeavor, and also Dr. Lewis is leading the NSF project, and it's kind of hard to understand the project name. International Partnerships and Technological Leapfrogging in China's clean energy sectors. And it's leapfrogging, so she's going to explain to you more about this. And also her book, recent book, Green Innovation in China, received the 2014 Harold and Margaret Sprout Award by the International Studies Association for Best Book for the year in environmental studies. I think you all should read it. And also, she was National Academy's committee on the US-China cooperation on electricity from renewables. So this National Academy has many the committees and produce monograph. And if you're interested, I can actually point to you the monograph. She has advised agencies, including domestic one is UNIDO and USAID. So she was advisory board to ACOR, also and US-China program. So she has PhD from the Berkeley and also MA from Berkeley. And I know some of you are actually Berkeley graduate. And before further ado, please join me in welcoming Professor Lewis.
Thank you very much. Thank you all for coming this afternoon, and I'm very appreciative of the invitation to speak with you today. So thank you very much for having me. Today, the title of my talk is China's Role in Global Clean Energy Technology Development. And so I thought I would speak a bit about sort of what is happening generally, both internationally and then domestically in China as relates to clean energy. And particularly how this is influencing the international discussion on climate change and the climate change negotiations in the United Nations. I want to start by mentioning the recent bilateral deal between China and the United States. You may remember last November, the presidents came together for a summit and announced what I think many of us in this field thought was really a groundbreaking deal between the two countries, in that both countries just simultaneously announced the actions that they were going to do to address climate change. And I think this is an extremely important, not just for what's happening in both countries domestically, which I'll talk about, but particularly for the upcoming climate talks that will be taking place in Paris at the end of this year, where, as you may know, countries are trying to reach a new global agreement on climate change, following on the Kyoto Protocol and the negotiations since then. So the key elements of this announcement, which were particularly notable, the United States, of course, agreed to take on an economy-wide target to reduce its emissions 26 to 28% from 2005 levels by 2025, and to try to do this actually on the more aggressive end. China also, for the first time, announced that it would try to achieve the peaking of CO2 emissions around the year 2030. And to try to peak early, as well as announced a goal to increase the share of non-fossil fuels in primary energy to 20% by 2030. This includes renewable energy as well as nuclear power. And so this announcement was really done with the intention of trying to really motivate other countries as well in the international climate talks. So China's goals from last November have now been enshrined in its pledge that it has submitted to the United Nations in advance of Paris. And so this includes the targets I mentioned, as well as a new, what we call carbon intensity target as well. So I think these are quite significant because, of course, this is the first time that China has actually mentioned its emissions would peak. If you study China energy data, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with the statistics, for many years it looked like China's emissions, both its energy consumption and its greenhouse gas emissions, would essentially grow exponentially for the coming decades. And so all the modeling projections coming out of China and the United States and other places essentially just showed an upward slope. It's really just been in the last few years where we've realized that that's not actually the case because of domestic energy trends, which I'll talk a bit about today. And so I think that, you know, the real question is, which I want to focus on, and these are really the topic of my research, how can China transition to a lower carbon economy? And to do that, of course, it does take clean energy technology. So a lot of my work actually looks at how China has acquired clean energy technology. Where is that technology coming from? And whether China is contributing to green innovation. I'll just talk about this with a bit of discussion about how the United States and China are cooperating and could continue to cooperate on clean energy, and why I think that's important. So I mentioned that in the target, when China announced a peak year for the first time, when we see, this is a study that was done both by researchers at Tsinghua University and MIT here, which shows a very similar peak projection for China. And I show you this to point out that essentially if China's total carbon emission, United Nations in advance of Paris. And so I think that, you know, the real question is, which I want to focus on, and these are really the topic of my research, how can China transition to a lower carbon economy? And to do that, of course, it does take clean energy technology. So a lot of my work actually looks at how China has acquired clean energy. and whether China is contributing to green innovation. I'll just talk about this briefly today, but that was the topic of my last book. And so I think that, you know, the real question is, which I want to focus on, and these are really the topic of my research, how can China transition to a lower carbon economy? And to do that, of course, it does take clean energy technology. So a lot of my work actually looks at how China has acquired clean energy technology. Is contributing to green innovation. I'll just talk about this briefly today, but that was the topic of my last book. And then finally, I want to end with a bit of discussion about how the United States and China are cooperating and could continue to cooperate on clean energy, and why I think that's important. So I mentioned that in the target, when China announced a peak year for the first time, when we see, this is a study that was done both by researchers at Tsinghua University and MIT here, which shows a very similar peak projection for China. And I show you this to point out that essentially, if China's total carbon emissions are to peak in the year 2030, you would essentially have to scale up clean energy extremely substantially. If you can see here on the chart, are the green bar, the purple bar, this is wind, solar, hydropower, natural gas, all are going to have to be scaled up dramatically. And then you see down here on the bottom, the dark blue is coal, and you see coal essentially leveling off and then declining quite rapidly between now and the year 2050. Again, this is not something that, you know, many people thought would be possible for China. China still gets about 2/3 of its primary energy from coal and about 80% of electricity. So, you know, as you mentioned earlier, clean energy in China, you know, many people say China's not doing clean energy, but this is, you know, really about where China's going, right? And where it will have to go if it's going to actually achieve this emissions peak. This is a chart just showing you where China's energy has come from over the last few decades. And again, as you can see, coal is just by far the largest share. But I think what has really driven a lot of these changes in diversifying China's energy supply is the desire to become more efficient in how energy is consumed. China actually, between 1980 and 2000 approximately, was able to quadruple its economy while only doubling energy demand. And this is actually extremely impressive. No other country has been able to achieve that rate of improvement. And so that's the declining line you see sort of after 1980 here on this chart. But if you look at this little like blip in the chart where in the early 2000s, you actually had energy use growing faster than economic growth for the first time in several decades in China. This actually caught the attention of the leadership because this essentially means that their overall economy was becoming less efficient. This also had to do with a resurgence of heavy industry. And as you know, China is trying to move away from heavy industry, manufacturing cement, iron, steel, to more higher value added industries that essentially take less energy to produce the same unit of economic growth. This is better for them overall from an energy security perspective, and this is better for the environment from an emissions perspective. And then, of course, there are many other advantages to reducing coal use in China. One, of course, for those of you who spent time in China, you know well, is air pollution. Local air pollution is a very big concern, not just for human health. It's one of the leading causes of early mortality in the country, but also, you know, there are concerns about sort of the public becoming less satisfied with the current quality of the air, and this could lead to stability issues, which of course are of top concern for the government. This is actually a paper my student did that looked at on days when the PM 2.5, the particulate levels are very high, people are on Weibo essentially complaining and talking about it, and people are very, very aware of air pollution levels in their day-to-day activities in China. So I want to move to talking about what's happening in clean energy there. So globally, I think it's important to point out clean energy is actually now about a $300 billion a year industry. We used to think of clean energy as this sort of little niche sector with a little bit of money going into it here and there. There's more money on an annual basis now going into so-called clean energy than there is dirty energy. Just because when we look at new capacity that's being built, new power plants in the United States, for example, almost all the new power plants we're building here are either natural gas, which are fossil plants, but cleaner than coal, and then wind power, solar power. In most years, actually wind and solar power growth rates are much faster than they are in gas. And we have not built a new coal plant here in a while. We have not built a new nuclear plant either in a while. China has played a very big role in this investment. And in fact, wind energy in China, where a lot of my research is focused, represents the single largest investment in any clean energy technology that any country around the world has made in the last decade. So that's really, it's quite substantial, just the amount of investment that has gone into growing the wind power sector in China. So while I showed you in the early charts that coal is still a huge share of energy in China, coal is not going away tomorrow, right? And I don't mean to imply that it is. But again, if you look at what's going in annually in terms of new plants, we see this real shift that's taken place in the last few years, where if you go back, about 10 years ago, China was putting in 80, almost 100 new gigawatts of coal plants a year. That's, roughly, you heard the figures, that's like 2 new plants a week, essentially, large coal plants. But those numbers have really slowed down quite a bit. And so China is building much fewer coal plants. There's actually been a lot of media reporting in the last few days. They may put a moratorium on new coal plants. They already have done this in some of the most polluted parts of Eastern China. So when you look at, there's still a need for growing electricity supply. And so what's being built, still hydropower, but also wind power, solar power, nuclear power are playing an increasingly important role. And I haven't updated this yet for last year, but you would see this trend continuing and even increasing. So I think it was 2013 was the first year China actually installed more non-fossil capacity than fossil capacity in a single year. So that's a real shift. So I mentioned wind power has been a real success story in China. This is showing you the growth that we've seen just in wind energy over the last decade or so. And you can see that, for a while, the United States and China were sort of neck and neck. China has now installed far more wind turbines than the United States. Although, if you actually look at electricity production coming from these wind turbines, there is some concern that they're operating less efficiently than they could be, mostly due to constraints on the electric grid, which I'll talk about in a moment. And you also, I should mention, there's many companies globally, which is what my book looks at, that in China, which are now manufacturing state-of-the-art wind power technology, selling this technology in China, and exporting it around the world as well. Solar has also been, in more recent years, a really big success story in China. China installed more solar power last year than the rest of the world sort of installed that year, and there soon will have more solar than the United States, many other countries combined. It's really quite dramatic, the growth we're seeing there. Part of this is due to the fact that China has built up a very successful manufacturing industry in solar technology, and so these costs of the technology have come down very dramatically. Costs of solar, I believe it's about a 60% cost reduction in the last 5 years. So suddenly, when solar was much too expensive, is what China and many countries believed a few years ago, it's now cost competitive with most of the other technologies they would be looking at, particularly if you look at externality costs as well, like pollution. So there's very aggressive targets to expand all these technologies. I won't go through them in detail. This is showing you different scenarios for how China might scale up different low carbon energy technologies in the coming years. And they're really quite aggressive scenarios that people are looking at. This is one study that I participated in, which was done jointly with the Energy Research Institute of the National Development Reform Commission in China, along with several international experts and funded by the Energy Foundation, to look at what could a very high penetration scenario of renewable energy look like for China in 2050? Essentially, what would be the maximum scenario? This is more of a visioning study. This isn't necessarily what will happen, right? This is, if China did the best they could do, went sort of changed all models, went beyond all projections, what could they do that could actually be realistic? And they actually showed that China could get to 60% non-fossil sources in total energy and 80% of its electricity generation by 2050. So remember, right now they're at 80% coal. So this would be a very dramatic transformation, and it wouldn't be easy. This is a chart just showing you what this would actually look like on the ground. So you can see, again, coal takes this very steep decline in order to allow the other sources to scale up. You see huge increases in solar, both solar electricity as well as solar for heating, geothermal and other types of renewable energy. And this is what, essentially the trajectory for how wind and solar would have to be scaled extremely rapidly over the next couple decades. I think it's important to think about where would this go in China, right? So for many of you are very familiar with the geography of the country. So actually, it's Inner Mongolia is where most of the wind power is being developed in China. If you've been there, you know there's a lot of sort of flat grasslands, plains, a lot of wind, and it's been an extremely good place for wind development. Particularly the eastern part of Inner Mongolia is connected to the same electric grid as Beijing. So this actually is useful for helping feed the power demand of eastern China, northeastern China. But you can see that if you really wanted to get to this really, high scenario of wind, you've got to put wind turbines everywhere. And this is a problem, right? Because there's not a lot of just empty land that's not being used for other things. You can do sort of dual use agriculture and wind with solar as well. This is a possibility. But you can see that essentially if you're going to put wind, particularly throughout the northern part of the country, to some extent in the southern part, and lesser extent in the West, you would need to essentially move this electricity to where the demand is. You can see the same thing for solar. Solar is actually a bigger issue because the best solar resources in China are in the far western part of the country, particularly Xinjiang, Tibet. And you can imagine how challenging it would be if you sort of put a lot of solar farms out there, then you move that electricity, to Shanghai. This is a, very complex transmission and very inefficient transmission process. And this is talking about solar that would far exceed the power demand, even that, would already exist in those provinces, even under a scenario where that economic development would continue and these provinces would grow substantially in the next couple of decades. So you would need to essentially put in significant transmission capacity. This is power lines, right? You would have to build extensive infrastructure, around the country. This is costly. This is something China is doing, starting to do. But it's bigger than this. It's also thinking about power markets. Power sector reform is a big issue right now in China. How you think about pricing these technologies, how you incentivize the current large power companies, which are all still state-owned, very powerful companies. The grid companies, very, very powerful company in China, State Grid. They are not as excited about this vision, should I say, of the future, because it implies a very different model from what they're used to, and quite a few costs. It is a very different type of power grid when you're integrating, as we call it, intermittent resources, right? The sun is not always shining, the wind's not always blowing, so you have to actually think about how you keep the lights on, given these sort of new resources. And there are ways, which we can talk about if you're interested. And then finally, on this scenario, of course, if you switch to this, very cleaner vision of clean energy, you get very dramatic reductions in air pollutants, right? Sulfur dioxide, nitrous oxide. So this would be overall beneficial for health. One other thing that's happening, which could be quite important in China for incentivizing this transition, is the introduction of a so-called cap and trade system for carbon dioxide. So, for many years here in the United States, just about a block away, there have been very active debates about whether the United States should put a cap on its emissions and then develop an emissions trading system whereby companies would, buy permits, trade permits, do this in the most efficient way possible. The United States actually helped to pioneer this model for sulfur dioxide control in the Northeast. It was extremely successful. This is, for people who study environmental policy, this is believed to be one of the most effective, most cost-effective and environmentally effective environmental regulations we've ever done here. And so the idea is that this could apply to carbon. We're not actually doing that in this country, although a couple of states are looking at this, California and a few others. But China has announced they're going to do a national program starting in 2017. And right now they have 7 pilots which are underway, essentially experimenting with this and how it might work. There are policies, and I won't go into this for time in detail, but throughout the different government ministries and agencies in China which support clean energy from a variety of ways. So the Ministry of Science and Technology is supporting research and development in many of the new technologies, which will be important. Other agencies like the National Development Reform Commission, National Energy Commissions help support large demonstration projects, support subsidies to promote these technologies. And these are, spread throughout the economy. When you look at innovation coming out of China, this is just showing you U.S. patent applications in clean energy. So this is an imperfect measure, I would say, off the bat of innovation, particularly in China, because this is the U.S. view, not the China view. You can look at these data for the U.S., for China as well, from the State Intellectual Property Office. But this is coming out of the U.S. Patent Office. You see that even in the United States, Chinese innovation. Chinese patenting activities are already starting to show up here in terms of, very active inventors filing in the United States for inventions in clean energy, particularly in areas like clean coal, carbon capture technologies. These are all areas where China, if they're not leading now, they may be leading in 5-10 years. So I want to end with just a bit of a discussion about cooperation. I think there's a lot of reasons why it makes sense for countries around the world to cooperate with China on clean energy. Essentially, we have a lot of things going on politically related to clean energy. There's trade tensions, there's disputes right now in the world